There is something extremely strange happening inside your mind right now, and most people go their entire lives without ever noticing it. Thoughts are appearing in your mind at this very moment. Ideas, memories, judgments, small voices commenting on everything you see, everything you hear, and everything you feel. A constant stream of thoughts moving through your consciousness. And throughout your entire life, you have assumed something without ever questioning it. That these thoughts are you. That this inner voice is who you really are. That the thing speaking inside your head is the true author of your mind. But now I want you to try a small experiment. Something extremely simple and at the same time deeply unsettling. Observe the next thought that appears in your mind. Don't try to control it and don't try to stop it from appearing. Just wait. Within a few seconds, a thought will arise. It might be something like, "This is strange," or maybe, "What does he mean by that?" Or perhaps your mind will begin thinking about something completely random. Now ask the question that almost nobody asks. Did you consciously choose to think that thought? Or did it simply appear? Think about that for a moment. You didn't decide step by step to construct that thought. It simply emerged within your consciousness, complete, as if it had been delivered to you. And that raises a deeply uncomfortable question. If you didn't decide to think it, then who did? For a long time, this question seemed like pure philosophy. Something interesting to discuss, but impossible to answer in a concrete way. Until scientists began studying the functioning of the human mind with instruments capable of observing the brain in real time. And what they discovered was profoundly strange. Experiments conducted by neuroscientists showed that the brain begins initiating decisions even before you become aware that you've decided something, sometimes hundreds of milliseconds earlier. In other words, what you call my decision may simply be the moment when your consciousness becomes aware of something that has already begun happening inside the brain. Think about the implications of that. The thought appears first, and only afterward comes the feeling that you thought it. The internal narrative arises saying, "I had this thought," but the thought was already there before that narrative even began. This completely changes how we understand the human mind, because perhaps the voice inside your head is not the author of your thoughts. Perhaps it is only the narrator of them. Imagine watching a soccer match on television. There is the game happening on the field, and there is the commentator describing what is happening. The commentator narrates every play, every movement, every goal, but he is not creating the game. He is simply reporting something that is already unfolding. Now imagine spending your entire life believing that the commentator is the one playing the game. That is exactly the kind of confusion that may be happening inside the human mind. The voice that comments on your thoughts may not be their origin. It may simply be consciousness becoming aware of what has already emerged within the mind. When you begin to notice this, something very strange happens. You start to see that thoughts appear, remain for a few seconds, and then disappear. One thought arises, another replaces it, then another, then another. A constant stream of ideas passing through consciousness. But there is something that remains present during this entire process. Something that observes all these thoughts coming and going. This silent observer is almost never noticed directly because attention is usually focused on the content of thoughts, not on the space where they appear. But if you observe carefully enough, you begin to notice that there is a fundamental difference between thoughts and that which perceives the thoughts. And this is where the investigation becomes even deeper. Because if you do not consciously create your thoughts, then where do they come from? This question may seem simple, but when scientists and philosophers began investigating it seriously, they realized they were facing one of the greatest mysteries of human existence, the mystery of consciousness itself. Thoughts seem to arise from an invisible place within the mind. They appear without warning, without conscious planning, without our being able to predict exactly what the next one will be. And yet we identify with them completely. We build our identity around them. We believe they define who we are. But what if that assumption is incomplete? What if thoughts are merely mental events arising within something far larger than the mind itself? Throughout history, different philosophical and spiritual traditions have pointed to this same possibility. The idea that consciousness is not produced by thoughts, but that thoughts appear within consciousness. In other words, you may not be the voice inside your head. You may be the one who is listening to that voice. If that is true, then the entire way we understand identity, mind, and even reality itself may be based on a very deep confusion. Because perhaps you have never been your thoughts. Perhaps you are simply the space in which they appear. And this brings us back to the question that started all of this. If you do not create your thoughts, then who or what is thinking through you? That is the question we will explore until the end. Because when you truly understand the answer, the way you see your mind, your identity, and even reality itself may change completely. To begin answering the question we left open, if you don't create your thoughts, then where do they come from? We need to look more deeply at something science has discovered about how the human brain works. For a long time, it was believed that the mind functioned like a kind of conscious command center, where decisions were made deliberately and thoughts were created intentionally. But in recent decades, as neuroimaging technologies have become more advanced, scientists have begun to realize that most mental activity happens outside the reach of consciousness. The human brain is constantly processing information in the background. Millions of sensory signals, memories, associations, and patterns are analyzed automatically before you even notice anything. In other words, there is an entire level of mental processing happening silently before any thought appears in conscious awareness. Imagine the brain as a massive prediction system. Instead of simply reacting to the present, it is constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next. To do this, it uses everything that has ever happened to you in the past. Every experience in your life, conversations, emotions, successes, frustrations, and lessons learned, is stored in neural networks that function like pattern recognition systems. When something in the present resembles, even vaguely, something that happened before, these systems activate automatically. They begin predicting what might happen next and generate thoughts that seem to be responding to the current situation. But in reality, many of these thoughts are not responses to the present. They are echoes of the past being projected into the future. This explains something many people have already noticed in their own experience. Certain thoughts repeat themselves constantly. The same worries, the same fears, the same interpretations about yourself or about the world. It can feel as if the mind is always playing the same recordings. And in a sense, it is. Because the brain learns through repetition. The more a particular pattern of thought is activated, the stronger it becomes within the neural network. Over time, these patterns begin to arise automatically, without conscious effort, as if they were natural responses of the mind. For example, imagine a person who had several difficult experiences trying to express their opinions in the past. Perhaps they were interrupted, criticized, or ignored during important moments. The brain records these experiences and creates a predictive pattern. Speaking up may be dangerous or uncomfortable. Years later, whenever a situation arises where that person needs to express themselves, thoughts begin appearing automatically. Better not say anything. Maybe this will cause conflict. No one will take this seriously. These thoughts may feel like rational analyses of the present moment, but in reality, they are projections based on old experiences. What is most interesting is that the brain does all of this extremely quickly, long before consciousness enters the scene. By the time the thought finally appears in conscious awareness, the process that generated it has already happened. It is as if consciousness is receiving the final result of an extremely complex calculation that was performed behind the scenes. And then the inner voice begins commenting on the thought as if it were its author. This dynamic creates a very convincing illusion, the feeling that you are deliberately thinking, when in reality you are observing the result of automatic processes that have already occurred. That does not mean consciousness has no role. On the contrary, The role of consciousness may be far more important than simply producing thoughts. It may be the space in which those thoughts are noticed, evaluated, and in some cases allowed to pass without being followed. When someone begins observing their own mind carefully, something curious starts to happen. You realize that you do not have direct control over which thoughts appear first. They simply arise. But you may notice something different. There is a moment immediately after a thought appears when you can choose whether you will engage with it or not. That small space between the appearance of a thought and the reaction to it is extremely important. Normally, this space goes unnoticed. The thought appears and immediately triggers an emotional reaction or a chain of other thoughts. One worrying thought leads to another, then another, then another, until the mind is completely immersed in an entire story that began with a single idea. But when you start observing this process more clearly, you realize that thoughts can arise and disappear without you having to follow them. This simple observation begins to change your relationship with your own mind. Instead of feeling like you are being pulled along by every thought that appears, a new sensation begins to emerge. The feeling that you are observing something that is happening within you. As if thoughts were transient mental events, not permanent definitions of who you are or how reality works. It is exactly at this point that the investigation becomes even more interesting. Because if thoughts are produced by unconscious patterns based on the past, that means much of what we think about the present may not be an objective description of reality. It may simply be an automatic prediction based on previous experiences. This helps explain why two people can experience the same situation and interpret it in completely different ways. Each mind filters the present moment through different patterns built throughout life. The brain is constantly trying to confirm the predictions that already exist within it, and many times it finds exactly what it is looking for. But something even more surprising is happening in this process. Something that connects the way we think with the way we perceive the reality around us. Because when you begin to notice that thoughts are automatic predictions of the brain based on the past, a new and inevitable question arises. If thoughts are predictions, to what extent are they influencing the reality you perceive? At first, this question may seem strange. After all, reality appears to simply exist, out there, independently of how we think about it. But when scientists began studying the relationship between perception, expectation, and human behavior, they discovered something very interesting. Our mental predictions deeply influence how we interpret what happens around us. In other words, what you expect to see often determines what you actually perceive. And when that expectation repeats itself many times, it begins to shape how you react to the world, which in turn influences the kinds of experiences you end up having. And this is where the investigation takes another important step. Because when you begin to realize that thoughts arise automatically, based on patterns from the past, and that these thoughts influence how you perceive reality, then a completely new possibility appears. Perhaps the key is not to try to control every thought that appears in the mind. Perhaps the key is something much simpler and much more powerful. Learning to observe thoughts without automatically becoming identified with them. And when this begins to happen, the relationship between your mind and the reality around you starts to change in ways that few people imagine. Because the question we started with still has not been fully answered. If thoughts arise from unconscious patterns, and if you are not truly their author, then what exactly are you within this entire process? That is precisely the question that begins to open the next stage of this investigation. The question we are exploring now becomes even deeper than it first appeared. If thoughts arise automatically from unconscious processes in the brain, then the identity we build around those thoughts may not be as solid as we imagine. For most of our lives, we learn to define ourselves through the narratives that arise in the mind. I am this kind of person. I think like this. I believe this. I can't do that. These phrases seem to describe who we are, but if we observe carefully enough, something curious becomes clear. All of them are just thoughts. Ideas that appear within consciousness, remain there for a while, and can later be replaced by others. At some point in childhood, someone may think, "I am shy." At another moment in life, that same person may think, "I'm becoming more confident." Years later, in a different context, the thought may arise, "I was never really shy. I was just more observant." Identity seems to change according to the narrative the mind constructs at each stage of life. This raises an extremely important question. If what we call identity can change over time, then perhaps identity is not something fixed. Perhaps it is simply a story the mind tells about itself. The human brain loves stories. It needs them in order to organize experience. Imagine trying to live without any internal narrative, without any explanation about who you are, where you came from, or where you are going. The mind constantly tries to create a sense of continuity. To do this, it connects memories from the past with interpretations of the present and expectations about the future. In this way, what we call the self emerges, a relatively coherent narrative that links different experiences across time. But this narrative has a very interesting characteristic. It is always being updated. Every new experience can slightly modify the story we tell about ourselves. Sometimes the change is subtle. Other times, it can be radical. A single event can completely alter how someone sees their own life. People who go through extreme challenges, profound discoveries, or transformative moments often report exactly this. At a certain point, they realize that the story they were telling about themselves did not have to continue in the same way. This turning point usually begins with a very simple observation, the realization that thoughts are not absolute facts. They are interpretations, and interpretations can change. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now. Just remember it when the time feels right. For example, imagine a simple situation. Two people receive the same criticism at work. For one of them, the event immediately triggers a chain of negative thoughts. I'm not good enough. I ruined everything. This proves I shouldn't be here. The mind builds an entire narrative in just a few seconds. But for the other person, the same criticism may produce a completely different thought. Interesting. Maybe I can improve this. The external experience is almost the same, but the interpretation changes everything. This happens because each mind operates with different sets of expectations and memories. The brain is constantly trying to predict what experiences mean based on what has happened before. But when we begin to observe this process more clearly, something liberating becomes visible. Thoughts are just automatic interpretations, not necessarily definitive descriptions of reality. This simple recognition opens a mental space that previously seemed non-existent, a space between the appearance of a thought and the decision to believe it. Normally, this space is so small that it goes unnoticed. The thought appears and immediately becomes truth in the mind. But when someone begins to develop greater awareness of their own mental functioning, this space begins to grow slightly larger. And within this space, something extremely important appears: the ability to observe the mind itself. When you notice a thought arising and are able to simply recognize it as a thought without automatically identifying with it, something interesting happens. The mind begins to slow down. The flow of narratives loses some of the power it once seemed to have. Instead of being carried away by every idea that appears, you begin to notice that thoughts are simply transient mental events. Some of them are useful, others are just noise. Some may help solve real problems. Others simply repeat old stories that no longer make sense in the present. And the more someone develops this capacity for observation, the clearer a fundamental distinction becomes. There is a difference between thoughts and that which perceives the thoughts. This distinction may seem subtle at first, but it completely changes how we understand the mind. Because if you can observe a thought, that means the thought cannot be you. The observer and the observed object are not the same thing. If you observe an emotion arising, then that emotion is not exactly who you are. If you observe a thought appearing and disappearing, then that thought cannot be your essential identity either. This leads us to a very interesting possibility. Perhaps what you truly are is closer to the observer than to the content that is being observed. In many philosophical and contemplative traditions, this idea is described as pure consciousness or observing awareness. The notion that there is a level of experience that simply perceives what is happening without necessarily identifying with every mental event that arises. But here another fascinating question emerges. If there is this silent observer within human experience, where does it come from? Is it just another process of the brain? Or could it be something even more fundamental than the thoughts themselves? When scientists began to investigate the nature of consciousness more deeply, they realized they were facing an extremely difficult problem. The brain can explain many mental processes: memory, language, emotion, decision-making. But explaining why there is a conscious experience at all is far more complicated. This mystery became known as the hard problem of consciousness. Why do electrical and chemical processes in the brain produce a subjective experience? Why is there something it feels like to be you in this moment? That question remains open to this day. And the more scientists investigate it, the more they realize that consciousness may be one of the most fundamental aspects of reality. Some researchers have begun to consider the possibility that consciousness is not merely a byproduct of the brain, but a basic feature of the universe, something that may exist in different forms within different systems. This idea is still being intensely debated, but it raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps consciousness is not simply something the brain produces. Perhaps the brain is something consciousness uses in order to manifest in certain ways. If that is true, then the relationship between mind, brain, and reality may be far more complex than we imagine. Because perhaps the human mind is not just a collection of automatic thoughts produced by neural patterns. Perhaps there is something deeper behind all of it. Something that simply observes, perceives, and experiences the flow of life unfolding. And when someone begins to explore this possibility carefully, something curious happens. Everyday experience begins to change slightly. Thoughts still appear. Emotions still arise. Life continues exactly as before. But now there is a new layer of perception, the awareness that all of this is being observed. And the more someone investigates this observation, the clearer a question becomes, one that pushes the investigation even further. If you can observe your thoughts, if you can perceive your emotions, if you can even notice the stories the mind creates about who you are, then who exactly is this silent observer that is perceiving all of this right now? This is the question that begins to open the next stage of this journey. When we arrive at this question, who is the observer that perceives thoughts? The investigation begins to enter an even deeper territory. So far, we have seen that thoughts arise automatically, that the mind creates narratives to organize experience, and that there is a clear difference between the thoughts that appear and the consciousness that perceives those thoughts. But if there is something within you capable of observing all of this happening, then we need to look much more carefully at the nature of that observer. The first thing you can do is an extremely simple experiment. Observe your own experience right now. You can perceive the sounds around you, perhaps the sound of the environment, perhaps the sound of your own breathing, maybe some distant noise. Now observe the sensations in your body, the contact of your feet with the ground, the position of your hands, the sensation of the breath moving in and out. And now observe the thoughts that appear while you do this. Perhaps your mind is analyzing what is being said. Perhaps it is asking questions. Perhaps it is remembering something. All of this can be perceived. But here is the important point. Everything you can perceive appears within your experience. Sounds appear. Sensations appear. Thoughts appear. Emotions appear. Mental images appear. And all of these things can constantly change. A thought arises and disappears. A sound appears and then fades away. An emotion may last for a few minutes and then transform into another. The content of experience is always changing. But there is something that does not seem to change in the same way. The very capacity to perceive. The consciousness that is present while all these changes are happening. This consciousness has no form, no color, no size. You cannot point to exactly where it is located in the same way you point to a physical object. And yet it is clearly present, because without it, no experience could be perceived. When you begin to observe this more closely, something curious becomes clear. Everything you call my experience happens within consciousness. Thoughts happen within consciousness. Sensations happen within consciousness. Even the sensation of being a separate self seems to arise within this field of experience. This raises a possibility that at first may seem strange. Perhaps consciousness is not inside the mind. Perhaps the mind is happening within consciousness. For a long time, the dominant view in science was that the brain creates consciousness in the same way a computer processes information. In this view, neurons interact with one another and, at some point in that process, conscious experience emerges. But as researchers began to study this phenomenon more deeply, they realized that explaining exactly how consciousness arises from matter is not as simple as it once seemed. The brain is certainly involved in conscious experience. Damage to certain areas can alter memory, perception, emotions, and even aspects of personality. But explaining how electrical and chemical signals transform into the subjective experience of being alive, the sensation of seeing colors, hearing sounds, or feeling emotions, remains one of the greatest mysteries in science. Some scientists have therefore begun exploring alternative hypotheses. One of them is the idea that consciousness may be a fundamental aspect of reality, something that does not necessarily need to be produced by the brain, but may exist in some form within the fabric of the universe itself. This idea appears in several modern theories, such as panpsychism and certain interpretations of information physics. There is still no scientific consensus about this, but the fact that the possibility is being considered already shows how deep the mystery of consciousness truly is. Interestingly, many ancient philosophical traditions explored a similar idea long ago. In many cultures around the world, we find descriptions of consciousness as something fundamental, something that does not belong only to the individual, but is present throughout reality. In these traditions, the individual mind would be only a particular expression of a larger field of consciousness. When we observe our own direct experience, this idea begins to make a little more sense. Think again about what you can perceive right now. Sounds, thoughts, sensations, emotions, all of these appear within your experience. But the consciousness that perceives them seems always to be present, regardless of what is happening in the content of experience. Recognizing this can create a subtle but profound shift. Instead of feeling completely identified with every thought or emotion that arises, a sense of inner space begins to emerge. Thoughts still appear, but now they are seen as movements within the mind, not as absolute definitions of who you are. Emotions still arise, but they can be perceived as temporary experiences passing through consciousness. This type of perception does not mean that life becomes distant or disconnected. On the contrary, many people report that when they begin to notice this difference between consciousness and mental content, the experience of life becomes clearer and more present. Small moments begin to be perceived with greater intensity. The sound of the wind, the sensation of breathing, the texture of a conversation with someone close. The mind continues functioning, but it no longer completely dominates experience. But there is another extremely interesting implication in this investigation. If consciousness is the field where all experience occurs, then the way the mind interprets reality can deeply influence what you perceive in the world. Not necessarily by changing the physical laws of reality, but by altering the way experiences are interpreted, organized, and responded to. This means the human mind can function as a kind of filter. The brain receives an enormous amount of information from the environment every second, far more than could possibly be processed consciously. To deal with this, the brain selects, interprets, and organizes information according to patterns learned throughout life. This process determines which aspects of reality capture your attention and which ones go unnoticed. In other words, each person lives within a version of reality that is partially shaped by their own mental patterns. The external world continues to exist, but the way it is perceived depends deeply on the structure of the mind that observes it. And when someone begins to see this clearly, an important understanding emerges. The experience of reality is not only something that happens outside of you, it is co-created through the interaction between the external world and the internal processes of the mind. This brings us again to the central question that began this entire investigation. If thoughts arise automatically, if the mind interprets reality based on patterns from the past, and if there is a consciousness observing this entire process, then who are you within this experience? Are you the thoughts that appear? Are you the stories the mind tells? Or are you something more fundamental, the very consciousness that perceives all of this happening? This question begins to lead us to the final point of this journey. Because when someone truly explores this question to the end, something surprising begins to reveal itself about the relationship between mind, consciousness, and reality itself. And that is exactly what we are about to discover in the next part. When we reach this point in the investigation, something begins to become clear in an almost inevitable way. Throughout our lives, we have learned to look outward in search of answers about who we are. We look for definitions in society, in the roles we play, in the stories we tell about the past, and in the expectations we project onto the future. But when we begin to directly observe the functioning of the mind and consciousness, we realize that the question of identity may never have been answered by looking only at the content of experience. Because thoughts change, emotions change, circumstances change. The narrative of life itself changes constantly. And yet there is something that remains present while all these changes occur: the consciousness that perceives them. Return for a moment to your direct experience. Think of something that happened 10 years ago, perhaps an important moment in your life, a decision, a major change, a meaningful encounter. Now think of something that happened only a few days ago, a recent conversation, a task you completed, a small, everyday event. The circumstances are completely different. The scenery of life has changed, the people may be different, and the thoughts and emotions from those moments have already disappeared. But there is something that connects all these experiences: the sense of being present while they happened. The consciousness that was there observing each moment. That same consciousness is present now. It was present when you were a child, when you learned new things, when you faced challenges, and when you experienced moments of joy or difficulty. Everything in life changes, yet the fundamental experience of being conscious seems to remain constant over time. This leads us to a profound realization. Perhaps what we call I is not merely the collection of thoughts, memories, and stories the mind constructs. Perhaps these things are only contents appearing within something larger, the consciousness that is perceiving the experience of life unfolding. When this idea begins to be perceived not only as a concept, but as a direct observation, something interesting happens in the relationship with the mind. Thoughts continue to arise, but they begin to be seen as temporary events. Emotions still appear, but they no longer seem like permanent definitions of identity. The stories the mind tells about the past and the future continue to exist, but they no longer appear as absolute as before. This does not mean the mind stops being useful. On the contrary, the mind remains an extremely powerful tool for solving problems, planning actions, and understanding the world. The difference is that there is now a clearer recognition that thoughts are tools, not necessarily the essence of who you are. When someone begins to live with this perception, a sense of inner space appears that previously seemed non-existent. Situations that once triggered automatic reactions can begin to be seen with greater clarity. A negative thought arises, but now it can be observed before it turns into an entire chain of worries. A difficult emotion appears, but it can be perceived as a temporary experience that will eventually pass. This space between perception and reaction creates new possibilities for response. Instead of acting automatically from old patterns, the ability emerges to choose more consciously how to respond to life's situations. Small changes in this process can have enormous effects over time, because each decision influences the direction that life experience begins to take. But there is something even deeper within this understanding. When we realize that thoughts, emotions, and perceptions arise within consciousness, we begin to understand that the experience of reality is not only something that happens outside of us, it is also something that happens through the way the mind interprets and responds to the world. Each person lives within a version of reality shaped partly by their own mental structure. The brain selects information, interprets events, and constructs narratives about what is happening. These narratives influence emotions, decisions, and behaviors, which in turn shape future experiences. In other words, there is a constant interaction between consciousness, mind, and reality. When someone begins to see this dynamic clearly, an extremely powerful question emerges. If thoughts are merely interpretations, if emotions are temporary responses, and if consciousness is the space where all of this appears, then who do you choose to be within this experience? This question is not merely philosophical. It has practical implications for how we live each moment of life. Because although we cannot control everything that happens in the external world, something always remains available: the ability to observe how we respond internally to what happens. We can observe thoughts without automatically believing all of them. We can feel emotions without assuming they permanently define who we are. We can notice old stories of the mind without repeating them indefinitely. This capacity for observation does not eliminate life's challenges. Difficult situations will continue to exist. The world will remain unpredictable in many ways. But the way we experience those situations can change profoundly when there is enough awareness to see what is happening within the mind. And this brings us back to the point where everything began. At the beginning of this journey, we asked a simple question: observe the next thought that appears in your mind. Did you choose to think it, or did it simply appear? Now, after exploring all of this, that question begins to reveal something much deeper. Thoughts appear, emotions arise, narratives form within the mind. But there is something that perceives all these movements, something silent, always present, observing the experience of life unfolding moment after moment. Perhaps you are never only the thoughts that pass through your mind. Perhaps you are that which is aware of them. And when this perception begins to become clear, something changes in a subtle but powerful way. Life continues exactly as before, with challenges, moments of joy, uncertainties, and discoveries. But now there is a new perspective within experience. A perspective in which thoughts are seen as mental events, not absolute definitions of reality. Where emotions are recognized as temporary movements of the mind, and where the consciousness that observes all of this remains present, silent, open, and capable of perceiving each moment as it arises. In the end, the question that seemed so mysterious at the beginning may have a surprisingly simple answer. If you do not consciously create all the thoughts that appear, and if you can observe those thoughts arising and disappearing, then perhaps the real question was never, who is thinking? Perhaps the most important question is another one. Who is the one who is aware? If this message truly resonated with you, if you felt that quiet inner shift, that sense that your mind is ready for something greater, I left a resource in the pinned comment that goes deeper into this process. I only recommend it for those who feel genuinely ready to accelerate their results, but follow it in your own time. If it calls to you, you'll find it there. Everything you just heard about resistance, attention, and the way consciousness shapes experience becomes much clearer when you understand the step that came before this. In the previous video, we explored a deeper question. If you can observe your thoughts, your emotions, and even the stories your mind creates about who you are, then who is the silent observer perceiving all of it? That investigation reveals the difference between the mind and the consciousness that observes it, and shows how much of what we call reality is shaped by the patterns through which the mind interprets experience. Without seeing that clearly, the mechanism of resistance can remain only an idea. But once you understand the nature of the observer itself, everything you heard here about attention, perception, and the creation of experience begins to make much more sense. The previous video is on your screen now.